This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
You'd be stretching the definition when you called him a high school dropout. That's because Milton Humason quit high school after just 2 days. Then this teenage mule skinner guided mules up the steep rocky trails to the summit of Mount Wilson, east of Los Angeles, where what would then be the world's most powerful telescope was being installed. Later, he wrangled himself a job as a janitor at the observatory, and over the next decade or so, skyrocketed to becoming the world's foremost observer and photographer of distant galaxies. Did you catch the name? Biographer Ron Voller joins us for this episode of Biz News Interviews to correct that. Ron, you have written a new book about what might be the least known but most major astronomer of the 20th century. Tell us a little bit about who you are writing about and why.
His name is Milton Humason, and he was the partner of Edwin Hubble in discovering the Big Bang. And most people don't know his name, but he was essential to the work in discovering the Big Bang. And a different sort of a guy. He was a card playing, tobacco chewing, moonshining storyteller from the backwoods, who just happened to discover a gift he had for photographing stars. And it was he who brought down the evidence that he and Hubble used to formulate the expanding universe experimentally.
Yeah, I understand. He was a high school dropout.
Correct. And I didn't even get through 2 days. He quit after his first day of high school to go up to the top of this mountain, Mount Wilson, outside of Pasadena, California, where they just happened to be building the world's foremost observatory, the first half of the 20th century anyway. And he worked at a hotel up there. He became a bellhop at the age of 14. And then a year and a half later, he cheated and told them he was 16 before he actually was. And he became a cowboy and a pack mule train driver, and actually was one of the lead cowboys in helping to drive these mule trains up this 10-mile slope to the summit of Mount Wilson with all the materials they were using to build this observatory that at the time he had no hope of joining, and only joined it later as a janitor in 1917, shortly after this big telescope, the 100-inch telescope, the biggest telescope built at that time, was going online, as we call it. And but he was a janitor at this observatory.
How can somebody with such a, how shall I put it, humble background, although diverse background, make such a great contribution to science?
Yeah, it's a combination of, he had a natural ability to follow his bliss. He kind of gravitated to things. He was as I said, he was very likable because he was a natural born storyteller, and he was not like anybody else on the mountain. But the thing that he discovered this gift because he actually had a form of color blindness that allowed him to see contrast between black and white exceptionally clearly. And so when a friend of his gave him an opportunity to photograph the stars at night, he looked at what Humason had done and he thought, this can't be right. I mean, this guy can't be this good at photography right off the bat like this. And that started, it took a long time for him to realize what became, out of the blue really, this new dream of his to be actually join the ranks of the astronomers.
With a background like his, despite what he helped discover, the Big Bang Theory, how was he accepted in the scientific community?
That's a great question. I think Milton suffered from imposter syndrome for much of his career. I think, having an eighth grade education, he published his first article in 1919 with his friend Seth Nicholson, who was at the observatory and was a great orbital prognosticator. He could really do the math. And the two of them published their first joint article together in the Astronomical Society of the Pacific. And by 1922, Milt was still not on the team, even though he had published nearly 20 articles. And the problem that he had was this eighth grade education. He didn't come from the right stock, if you will. He didn't have the status that he needed for George Hale, who was the founder and director of the observatories, to allow him to join the ranks. He just wouldn't promote him. He didn't feel it was right. And he didn't feel that he could pass Humason could pass muster with the board of the Carnegie Institute of Washington, which subsidized the operations at the observatory. And so it took a great long while, and it was only by a stroke of genius from Humason himself that he was eventually promoted virtually on the spot by acting director Walter Adams in 1922. It was June 25th, as a matter of fact, and they had to raise the dome of the 100-inch telescope and block it for 6 months or so while they fixed this truck system that rotated the dome while they were viewing. And these have to be extremely silent, smooth operating trucks. This is a massive dome, tens of thousands of tons of dome steel rotating around here. So any shuttering would disrupt these long exposures that the scientists were doing of the stars. And upon hearing what they were going to do, Walter Adams was not happy about the fact that he had to shut down the world's greatest telescope for 6 months. And Humason said, well, why don't we point the slit, that's the opening of the dome where they do the observing, why don't we point the slit due east? And at least then we can do whatever research we can do on the stars that come up, because they'll come up across that line through the slit, and we can observe during this period. Even though it'll be limited, we can still get some work done. And Adams just looked at him and just almost on the spot promoted him to the staff of the observatory. And you can see that indicated at the end of the logbook for the 100-inch telescope on the last page. The only thing written is slit opening 93.0, that's due east, June 25th, 1922, hum. It's a brilliant piece of Humason history.
What on earth got you interested in this, and how did you even find anything about him?
It's another great question. I've always been curious. My background is in music and literature, but I grew up in a family that was curious about a great number of things, architecture, design, along with music. My dad had over 200 patents to his name, and so there was a lot of curiosity. Was just part of my world. My mom had always kept me attuned to what was happening with the stars, noting the solstice and the equinox. And I've been also always curious about origins, and there is no greater origin than the origin of everything. And so I wanted to know more about how did science come to this decision that I'm sure a lot of people think this. How did we get to this point where we think that everything started from this pinpoint of energy? And so I started to read about it. And as I was reading about it, Humason popped off the page, and this little blurb about his 8th grade education and the mule skinner and the janitor, and then becoming this world-renowned observer. And I just needed to know more. Then the storyteller in me took over, and I couldn't put it down.
How did you find the information? Was he a subject of other biographies earlier than yours, or what?
Nope, that was a pretty cold path, Douglas. Let me tell you, it was not easy to dig up this intel. I wore out libraries in Winona, Minnesota, where Humason grew up. Um, the several libraries around the country, including Harvard, the Lowell Observatory, elsewhere. I really had to dig up a lot of information. But the great thing that happened to me was I met and befriended Humason's granddaughter, who had been raised by Milton and his wife Helen, her grandparents, to the age of 4 or so, while her mother was recovering from tuberculosis she had contracted as an Army nurse during World War II. And Anne and I and her family, she has 2 sons, very close with. She, they really, we really were able to exchange a lot of information. I had a lot of information about the family, none of them knew, but she could really fill in the details about Humason's personality, who he was. And so it was just over time, just digging up all the information I could. It took me 6 or 7 years to get to where I was feeling pretty complete. And then I started writing about him.
And how did his life end? I almost feel it might be a tragedy.
He retired to Mendocino in his 60s. He, like many astronomers, didn't want to put the work down. And then until after he'd walked away from it a while, and then he realized, oh no, this is much better. But he died rather suddenly of a heart attack in 1972. He was 81 years old, just about 82 years old.
He has no space telescope named after him or other statues or anything like that, as far as I know. Is that right?
No, Milton was a very humble guy, and he believed personally that Edwin Hubble should get the credit for the work, for the discovery, and so on. Although oddly enough, he believed in the discovery more than Hubble did. That's a long story. You can get that out of my book if you'd like to read it. But he's a kind of a cult figure. People have written songs about Milton Humason. They've written musicals about Humason. I've written his biography, and the subsequent biography of he and Hubble and the race to uncover the expanding universe. That's this latest book. He's got, he's got comets named after him, and he has made his impact. He made a great impact on cosmology. Most of the things that we're studying today were launched by Humason with Edwin Hubble. They really laid the groundwork for research in modern cosmology that has developed into, exoplanet research and black holes and things of that nature, gravitational lensing. He was involved in the development of all of these things.
Things that are still on the cutting edge of science today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As you were doing these years of research into his background, what surprised you the most?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. At first, it was just how difficult it was to uncover any information about him, to be honest. There are always, whenever you're in research, the really fun, surprising things come out of nowhere, where you attach families to one another. I would say surprising. I don't know. I felt a little kindred to Humason at times. There were times when I would be speaking to astronomers and astrophysicists, and were, capable of talking way over my head about any given subject, and thinking, wow, this must have been how Milton felt, especially in the beginning. I think the respect that people have for Milton Humason inside the industry was probably the most surprising element. I would go to book fairs or do talks with various astronomical groups, and there were people who from time to time would come up with stories that they had about Milton Humason. That was one very surprising bit. And then just how much a dislike there is in the industry for Edwin Hubble. A lot of respect for his abilities, but not a lot of love for the man. And I'm not sure that's completely due.
Where can people get more information about you and your books?
You go to my website, ronvoller.com. That has my books on it, my links to my podcast. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I put out every month, and has details about what's happening and where I'm going to be next, and all of that. It's probably the best way.
After all of this, Ron, are you a stargazer? Do you have your own telescope? You're out in the dark at night?
Oh yeah, I have a couple of telescopes. I like to take them out, set them up, and do impromptu star parties, and just let people, I'll point it at something. Jupiter is a great, a fan favorite, let's call it. It doesn't take much amplification to see the moons, for the 4 Galilean moons, and it's a fun thing to do. I'm not involved in research, at least at this point, but I do love to communicate to people the glory of the cosmos. It's a remarkable place.
What would you like to add that we haven't had a chance to talk about? It could be anything.
I think the Humason's journey really points out to me the idea that you never know where your opportunities are going to come in life, and you might discover things about yourself no matter what your age. Humason was nearly 30 when he started, and he was a janitor basically in 1921, and 10 years later he was standing with Albert Einstein having his photo taken, having proven to Einstein that the universe was expanding. If that can happen to an 8th grade educated janitor and cowboy, you never know where your opportunities will come. And I think, the lesson there is to be ready, and don't be afraid to take the opportunities when they come.
You've been listening to the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. That's BIZGNUS.com. Thanks for listening.